Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition here to give you some additional thoughts about the school board meeting. If you watched our recap, you already know a little bit about what we're going to say in terms of how we feel about some of the things that were discussed last night. But before we dive all the way into that, Heather, how are you doing?
Great, thanks. How about you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. So let's just get into it. Let's talk. So there were a couple of big conversations that happened, and a couple of big presentations that happened, right? And so, first of all, I'd say like the budget was a big presentation, capital improvement plan was a big presentation, but not a ton of discussion, right? There's some discussion, but not a ton. I think the dominant conversation amongst board members last night was around graduation, and this issue of like what is the threshold of who can participate or walk during graduation, versus who can't based on how many credits they have. um, and so the board went back and forth, had a big conversation about this. Almost every board member, except for maybe two, I think, participated in this conversation, saying that either they would feel more comfortable with having students complete all of their credits before having to walk, um, versus having wanting to allow students to walk even if they're more than two credits shy of graduating, letting them walk at this June, with their classmates. And so that was kind of the tension. So where the superintendent is right now with that is he's saying that they want only students who are only 0.75 credits behind to be able to participate at graduation, and that's the threshold. That's where he thinks that it's important to hold that threshold, so because that is more likely that those students will actually complete all of their credits by the end of the summer school period. That's only 23 days of instruction. We heard callers, I think led by MFT, the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, calling in to say we think that that number should grow to 2.25 credits. If you're behind 2.25 credits, you should still be able to walk at graduation this year, because that is the maximum amount of credits that a student could earn during summer school. Again, these 23 days of instruction. And so when it comes to this issue specifically, I see both sides of it. I have a lot of thoughts on it. But Heather, I want to go to you first. What were you hearing? What were you feeling during this conversation?
One of the things that Dr. Fearing said was that statistically they know about 33 to 50%, given, every year changes just a little bit, but that's the average, um, of those students don't even finish the 0.75. So during a normal school year, they always allow students to make up a 0.75 and still participate in graduation, and they do what they do a contract, right? So they extend maybe a project that they didn't get a good grade on or didn't finish, or they extend the timelines, or they have a chance to take a test again, and to do some work in summer school. So during a summer that is a non-pandemic school year, they see about 33 to 50% of students not finish those requirements even after they've signed that contract and they walk across the stage and get to participate in graduation. So, so Dr. Fearing's point was like, I don't know how increasing what they have to do over the summer actually increases the odds of students finishing this work. And she really felt like it would be confusing for families. Like, oh, wait, there's this more stuff that I have to do to get this paper when I already participated in the ceremony. So, I mean, that's for me, I found myself kind of like, oh, yeah, I can see that point. Oh, yeah, I can see that point. As each board member talked, I could really feel myself feeling this tug of like, students have never been asked this before. And also, like, but they haven't done the work, but also like what is the work? And so I really felt it was a hard conversation. And I think what we talked about in our last video is like, I don't think we got to the root of the problem in last night's board meeting. Um, that's really my takeaway.
Yeah, I think, um, when I heard the stat that I think actually the superintendent shared first, which was like 33 to 50% of seniors who we allowed to walk during graduation don't complete their 0.75 credits during that summer school period. I think that's when I kind of like shut down in terms of figuring out how do I feel, who's right around this issue around whether you should walk first or whatever. Um, I I shut down in that moment because I was like, so does that mean 33 to 50% of our students aren't like learning what they need to learn in order to be considered graduates of Minneapolis public schools? Um, and I mean, that's of people who hadn't completed their credits before
Right.
graduation, right? And so then increasing that threshold to 2.25, I was like, look, we only have again, we only have 23 days of instruction during this summer school period, and you're asking them to make up almost a full semester's worth of work. Um, and in 23 days, I just don't know, like, is it about getting the credits or is it about like actually learning, right? Because if it's not about getting, if it's just about like, if it's not about learning, right, then why is the number 2.25, right? Like, why don't we say if you're, 10 credits short, you can still graduate? Like, why wasn't that part of the conversation? It just felt like we were starting to create some arbitrary thresholds and rules that weren't actually aligned. Then the conversation wasn't actually aligned with those values, is around like, yeah, you know what? We want students, we want families, we want to create points of celebration. We want to create like points of motivation and celebration through this really difficult year, which is an admirable goal and an admirable value, like 100%. I'm not even trying to throw shade at any of that. But I do think, like, as a board of education, like, we have to ask ourselves if the superintendent is saying that they're going to try to help students recover up to 2.25 credits, which is, more than double. It's actually triple what they usually are able to get during a summer school period. Are we actually providing the same quality of learning? And on top of that, like, was the quality of learning during summer school actually like as high quality or as quality as a traditional school year, when they were supposed to initially get the credit, and they didn't get that credit, right? And so I think there's just a lot of questions for me there around like, yeah, like let's have this. It just felt like the board was having a surface level conversation about graduation ceremonies and not graduation ceremonies. And I think there's a deeper question that comes to like, are our students learning, that they just did not dive into, and they should have, um, because we should be auditing the effectiveness of our credit recovery system, and if students are actually learning, or if we're just asking them to jump through hoops for us, because, or the state, whomever. um, but are we preparing them for life after high school, which is what the point that you brought up in our shorter video.
Yeah, it's a complicated conversation, and I mean, I think what it does for me is it makes me think about kind of the deeper work. So next month we're going to be hearing our K through our birth to adult literacy plan for MPS. So this is a plan that has been being that our Department of Education has been working on for an entire year. And one of the things that we know, so here's the thing, like, yes, we can talk about the graduation ceremony. We also know 50% or more of our kindergartners don't know their letter sounds and names. So we kind of need to back this conversation all the way up to like, how far back are we failing students before this moment of graduation? And what is happening in our city that kindergartners don't know their letter sounds and names? And what are we going to do about that? And so I think, again, like, we'll be looking to the literacy conversation that's coming to say, okay, is this plan bringing forward like identifying the problem, because there's clearly a problem? Is
Hmm.
it talking about what we're going to do to change, and how is it showing us how we're going to measure, right, if we've met the goal? So let's go all the way back to kindergarten and start talking about that. And then, and let, I guess I would like to see our board ask as many questions about the literacy plan next month as they spent time debating about graduation ceremony, because I think they are equally important. As a matter of fact, I would say one is foundational to the other.
Right. Yeah, I think that, as we start to talk about, our literacy plan and all, like, I think all of this stuff really, like, I think, Senior Officer Moore's office, like, needs to be deeply evaluating all these things. I think even last night there was a mention of expanding online school to beyond just ninth through 12th graders. And again, like, that's an admirable goal, and I think is leaning into like the 21st century and also demonstrating like a recognition of what's been going on this school year, and what do families want. But you know before the board just like stamps that yes, like, have they asked the question, like, is our online school good? Like, is it effective? Is it quality? Is it like rigorous? Is it, going to be able to produce the outcomes that we actually want to see? Again, one of our core priorities is literacy in this district. And so, like, are we meeting those literacy? Do we have literacy goals? And then are we meeting those literacy benchmarks? Like, I don't know. I haven't heard those things. I haven't seen those things. It doesn't feel like anyone's being held accountable to those things. Um, and so I just think that we need to be asking some of these rigorous questions. And, I like, I wouldn't say jokingly, I very seriously over the last several um, board recaps and debriefs that we've done together have said, like, the board doesn't talk about academics enough. And I think last night was a perfect example of that, where like there's this very very connected topic around credit recovery, graduation, all these things, and we're not talking about learning. We're not asking critical questions about, like, are students actually learning as they go through this system of credit recovery, and also why do we have so many students that have to go through credit recovery? Like, what is happening in our buildings that is creating the need for credit recovery, and is there something different that we can do in order to support students so that they aren't having to go through credit recovery and still learning the material that they need to learn. So, um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and I think, and I mean, and we still aren't asking. Like, we know this falls along racial and socioeconomic lines consistently, and so we aren't asking hard questions of our teachers about this conversation either. Like, why like we need to believe that our children can learn. We need to believe that our students are here and that they are capable of all of these things, and they are. Our students, the students, we have beautiful, bright, amazing citizens, global citizens in our city that are children that spend 6 hours a day in our buildings, and they can do all of these things. And so anyway, we need a district and a school board and teachers that believe that they can.
yeah. So really quickly, want to dive into another conversation that we had in our recap around this idea of predictable staffing and equity.
Yeah.
Right. And so we talked a little bit about this. So again, predictable staffing was designed so that, no matter what building that you went into in Minneapolis public schools, you knew based on like how many students were in that building and what type of school it was, whether it was like an elementary school or K-8, middle school, high school, whatever, like you knew, what type of staffing structure to expect. Because before predictable staffing, right, like schools kind of picked and chose from a menu, and it was a wide variety. And if you had a powerful principal or a powerful school community, you could advocate for more positions or different positions versus other schools couldn't or didn't. And so it was just kind of like the Wild West here when it came to staffing decisions. And so, this
Or
superintendent,
maybe more like the privileged Southwest.
okay. So the superintendent came in and said, "Look, we need to have predictable staffing. We need like this is a right for students to have a minimum of understanding who is going to be in their buildings to provide supports to them." And last night, we heard the goal of uniformity. Like, why is uniformity the goal? And then they said the goal is to have uniformity in terms of our staffing structures within schools.
Right.
Director Surreal asked, why is the goal uniformity and why isn't the goal equity? Which I think is a really, really important question to be asking, because it, every school in Minneapolis doesn't have the same needs, right? We know that some schools have different needs. We know that Burroughs has different needs than, you know, a City View or a Nellie Stone Johnson or a Bethune, right? And so we need to figure out, how do we make sure that schools that have more needs actually get the supports that they need. And the superintendent said, like, we can't afford it. We this, essentially, right? He didn't say it in those direct terms, but the way that we interpreted
Pretty close.
the way we interpret it is, we can't afford equity. And so, Heather, we can keep this short because we did do a pretty deep dive into it in our last video. But what were your thoughts on that conversation?
Yeah, I just like equity isn't a kitten poster in an office, right? This is we keep using this word like it's a slogan and not like this is the lens through which we have to make hard, uncomfortable decisions because there has been a history of wrong. And so, like, it's not just like, oh, okay, so now equity is pie and we're going to do this and this. And equity is not saying we're going to stop allowing privileged and or wealthy schools to take too much. That's not equity. And that's actually where the super what I heard him say last night was like, we're going to draw that line at privilege hoarding and ending that. That's what I heard him say. And that's not equity.
Yeah.
That's not equity. That's just stopping the bleeding that's been happening.
Right. That's stopping inequity to try to get to equality, right?
Yeah. Mm.
And we need to figure out, how do we create equity within our system. And yeah, like I said in the shorter video, equity is not a thing that some years we can afford and some years we can't afford. Equity is a framework, it's a mindset. And I think, the equity, diversity, impact assessment was intentionally designed so that people didn't keep saying, oh, this year we can afford equity and this year we can't afford equity. Equity was a set of things to be considering as you make decisions, in how you allocate resources, how you, make certain decisions across the district. And I think actually really closely ties into our district's mindset around where it is, like, the state come in, and then also this federal funding from the America Rescue Plan that's coming to Minneapolis Public Schools. Because now, sure, the district is going to say, like, we have all of this additional money. Is now the time that we can afford equity? And can we now only afford equity for the next 3 years? The answer is no. And so we should be thinking about how we can create really targeted opportunities to make investments towards our students with these additional dollars. But all along, we could have been saying, how can we create more and more equity within this district? How can we push more resources into the areas we know need them the most, where we know we're struggling? Where, like, how can we make targeted investments? And I think that's the part that always frustrates me about, like, when we start talking about our legislative agenda and how we talk about the state. Like, yes, the district should be advocating to the state for more money. Like, that is the role of the district and the board, to ensure that they get as many resources as possible to serve students. But the money that is in their hands doesn't, like, they need to be thinking about how they actually equitably use that money. And I think they do that in some senses, but then like, it's examples like this where they think equity is saying, like, we're going to stop the privilege hoarding, like you said, we're going to stop inequities to try to create equality and still have inequitable outcomes. And so I think that part, to me, just gets really frustrating. And I just want the board to really embrace, and leadership to really embrace this idea of, we can have a deficit of $30 million, and we can have a surplus of, $100 million. Within all of that, and within that entire range, we still should be thinking about, with the resources that we have, how do we make targeted investments? How do we make sure that we use equity? It's not that only in years of surplus that we can think about equity, because we can afford it this year. Like, our community can't afford more years of Minneapolis public schools creating the opportunity gaps and the learning disenfranchisement that's been taking place in this city any
Mhm.
longer. Like we can't afford it. And so you can't wait until the state gives you the money to do it or the federal government gives you the money to do it. But by the way, the federal government is giving you the money to do it. And so I will just wrap with that. I know we got to go. Um, my last just quick push is we put out a survey related to the federal money that's coming to Minneapolis public schools, and we want to hear directly from you. Like, where do you think those dollars should be spent? Do you think those dollars should be spent and what issues do you think that money can solve? There's so many things. Teachers of color, um, summer school, right? Online learning, right? How can we improve those
Curriculum.
curriculum development, literacy plan, all these things? So we want to know from y'all, like, how should that money be used? And we'll include that link in the comments so that you can access it. But thank y'all for listening. And Heather, thanks for joining me today.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.